Hello, I'm George from Ireland. Here I am on Gunterstone Road in London, just off North End Road. And behind me, you can see the house where Sir Henry Rider Haggard lived. So he was born in, my goodness, I think it was in Suffolk in 1865. His father was a baronet, as to say, he had the title Sir. So it was to pass from father to son, as opposed to a knight when being called Sir dies with the individual. Sir, then the name, not just Sir, which you call any man being courteous. So a fairly well-off family. There were 11 children, of which Henry was the eighth. Henry the Eighth. I don't know if that's why they called him that. His father didn't hold Henry in high regard, and some of his brothers went to very well-known public schools. But when it came to Henry, his father didn't bother spending that much money on him, sent him to a small school at Garsington, just outside Oxford, that was run by a clergyman as a private school, because the favourite schools, Eton, Harrow, Winchester and so on, they're charities, it may surprise you to know, even though they're very pricey, because they're no shareholders, nobody makes a profit, any extra money is just ploughed back into the school. But some schools really were run as a business, and he went to one of those, later to Ipswich Grammar School, near where they lived. So then he tried to get into Sandhurst to train as an army officer, didn't make the entrance exam. He tried to get in the diplomatic service and he didn't make the grade. So his father appeared to be proved right, but then again, perhaps he had an inferior schooling to his siblings. Anyway, his father managed to secure him a post in South Africa, then a British colony, although it was a bit more complicated because the Boers had been there since 1652, as in those of Dutch stock, and they'd landed at Kaapstad and moved inland from Cape Town when the British came up with this outrageous idea of abolishing slavery. So for freedom, the Boers moved deeper inland, and freedom meant depriving others of their freedom. But anyway, they set up two republics, the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State. And then there were some various independent kingdoms run by the indigenous people, such as the Zulus. So he was an assistant to Buller. I can't remember the bloke's Christian name. And he was there at some notable events in South African history. And for instance, when they proclaimed that the Transvaal Republic was becoming part of the British Empire, the man who was supposed to read out the proclamation lost his voice. So the young Henry Rider Haggard had to do the needful. Anyway, so he eventually got himself a salary, but it wasn't very much, and he fell in love with a young lady, and his father said, well, you can't wed her till you have enough money, and then she went off and married someone else. I'm trying to remember her name. It'll come to me. So eventually he married another lady, had 4 children with her, 3 daughters and a son, though his son died at the age of 10. So back to Henry. Eventually he was knighted, as you'll see. Pretty sure it was a knighthood, not a baronetcy. Even if it had been a baronetcy, it would have died with him because he had no surviving son. So he returned to the United Kingdom with his growing brood after a while, and he was called to the bar, but he was not terribly successful in practice. Doesn't appear to have been committed to it. As I said earlier, in those days you didn't have to have a degree to be a barrister, although most of them did back then. And he spent most of his time writing novels instead, and he was superb at that, and indeed that made him more money, but that's probably because he didn't actually make much effort as a barrister. He doesn't appear to be very interested in politics, when he would really have had all the skills to make it in that. And the locale of many of his novels is Southern Africa. He wrote he wrote The Doom of Zimbabwe in 1898, which might seem apposite considering that Southern Rhodesia, i.e. Zimbabwe, had just been set up, and the indigenous people had rebelled against the British immigrants and been defeated, the first Chimurenga, or uprising. And it's amazing he even heard of Zimbabwe, which back then was a pile of ruins, these old buildings which had fallen into disrepair, and people didn't pay much interest in them, till decades later. And of course that eventually gave its name to the country of Zimbabwe. So what else about Rider Haggard? Well, King Solomon's Mines is his magnum opus, and it's been made into a film many times. So that's really the classic adventure story in colonial Africa, or perhaps pre-colonial Africa. So in the Rider Haggard oeuvre, there's some black saviours as well as some white saviours. Some people consider him to be a racialist author, having perpetuated racist stereotypes. And of course there are some black characters who come out badly out of this. Sometimes the protagonist is black, and indeed is a hero. So I haven't done a statistical study to say, does he show whites to be disproportionately good and black people to be disproportionately wicked? Perhaps. I'm not sure. I don't think it's as clear cut as his sternest critics would have us believe. So he got to know Rudyard Kipling, and he was an ardent imperialist like Kipling. The two got along very well, and they were writing about much the same thing. Though Kipling had spent time in India, I'm not sure if Kipling actually ever set foot in Africa, apart from, say, Suez, on his way to and from India. But they got along very well indeed. And so far as I know, H. Rider Haggard, as he was known, never published a poesy, and that was Kipling's main medium. So yeah, he lived on to 1925, and he became a fairly wealthy man with his house. It's quite a large house. We're in Hammersmith, not that much of an amazing area, so not stinking rich unless he lived somewhere else as well. And he's buried in his native Suffolk, if I've got that right. So that's just a little bit about Rider Haggard, and there was a lot of psychology in the plot, a bit of interior monologue sometimes. He was fascinated by psychical phenomena, and could the things happen like that? Could there be communication from beyond the grave, and so forth? And writing about the African witchcraft, and were these necromancers, did they have real power? Was their power merely psychological? A lot of speculation about that. That's enough about H. Rider Haggard. Toodaloo.